Room 206, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by McConnell. It was in the summer of 2014 that I first realized there was something seriously wrong with Room 206. I'd started working at the Marianne in June. Initially, it was one of the 3 part-time jobs that I was doing during the summer in an effort to raise some money for university fees. I had just finished my first year, and unlike my flatmates or the other people on my course, I wasn't going home or off on some find-myself backpacking trip during the summer holidays. Firstly, because I didn't have the money to pay for it, and secondly, because I didn't have the money to pay for anything, including next year's tuition fees. I needed to stay put and earn some coin fast before I even thought about going anywhere. Since my flatmates were all from loaded families and were more than aware that I was the resident pauper of the group, they made the discreet and hugely generous habit of paying for stuff during term time. I always made sure that I covered my rent in order to retain at least some scrap of dignity, but when it came to things like eating out, bills, and especially the regular drinking bouts that we would go on, I never really spent a penny. The same went for accommodation during the summer break. Since the 4 of us had decided that we wanted to stay on in the same flat after the summer, and since we all knew that student digs were a huge target for burglaries during this period, savvy criminals knowing full well that students would tend to leave the place unoccupied but still full of resaleable items over the summer. My flatmates had 2 choices. Either move everything they considered valuable back home with them before they went off on their merry travels, only to drag it all back to the unit again when the term started, or place their trust in me, and leave me to look after it all whilst they were away. I agreed to remain in place, as if I hadn't already planned to, on the understanding that for doing them the favour of staying behind and minding the place, I would be exempt from the living costs like rent and bills for the duration of the summer. It was a pretense on both sides. Of course, deep down, I knew that mates didn't have to do this for me, but they also knew that my financial situation and that this convoluted excuse gave them a reason to give me charity without them actually saying so, and either them or I getting embarrassed about it. So, basically, as long as I looked after the house and made sure no crackheads came in through the windows to steal the lad's PlayStation, I could stay there over the summer, rent and bills free, which was a massive help to me financially. Having reduced my bills to 0 for the near 3-month break, I decided to make sure that I put myself well and truly into the black by the end of summer by spending as little as possible and working my absolute backside off for the next 3 months. Since the students all left for the summer and I had nobody to socialize with anyway, it didn't seem much of a hardship to spend most of my time at work. In the meantime, I had a cunning plan to ensure that I was saving whilst I was earning. Every morning during that summer, I stacked shelves at a local supermarket, usually from 8:30 a.m. until 12 p.m. The advantage of this job was that I knew my mate's mum worked at the in-store cafe, and since there was virtually nobody there at that time of the morning, I could get a free breakfast every day, which helped me save on feeding myself. It also meant that I had first look at the items that would be going out reduced that day, and which would be labelled at ridiculously low prices, especially since it was one of my colleagues that was doing the labelling, and deciding at his discretion how much to mark the food down by. He realised very quickly which items I was really after, and that he'd be doing me a favour by marking them down to pennies. Many's the time that I left work with a belly full of breakfast, a rucksack full of tinned food, and a few loaves of out-of-date but still good bread that cost me a grand total of 58 pence, not to mention the fact that for every minute I was there, I was earning. 5 days a week I worked 2 10 shifts at a local burger joint close to the train station. A horrible job, but one that came with the additional perk of a meal being provided to every staff member on their break. It didn't take much to ensure that I packed an extra big lunch for myself and stuffed myself stupid, thereby saving on food costs. I also took home more than my fair share of anything left over. I still threw it into a bin bag when the manager was looking. It just happened to be a bin bag that I took with me at the end of the shift. From midnight to 6 on 5 nights a week, I worked the desk at the Mariand. Now, when most people hear that schedule, the first thing they ask is, when the hell did you have time to sleep? The answer is that I slept at the Mariand. The hotel itself was a gritty, low-budget place built with the help of government grants to accommodate staff and visitors coming for a big event held in the city in the early noughties. When all of that got moved on and the influx of people was over, the Mariand became a one-building city centre ghost town. With 214 rooms, most of which were never, ever filled, the place was mostly silent, only fractionally occupied, and must have been losing money hand over fist, which, for the first year that I worked there, suited me fine. On only my first shift working the night desk, I was trained by a lovable old rogue named Dave on exactly how to get the most out of the job. He told me exactly how he set up the desk so that the large office chair could be positioned under the CCTV camera. The management never checks it, and when they do, they're usually interested in the punters, not you. So you set your chair up beneath it, in the blind spot, put this old wooden crate over the wastepaper bin, and put a towel on it for a footrest. Et voila! You just get your head down until morning. You might have to get up once or twice if someone's booked a room to come to after they've been out clubbing and they stumble in at 4 a.m, but most of the time, they just find their way upstairs without disturbing you. You just sleep the night through and dream about your pay packet. Despite this invaluable advice, on my first shift, I was a good employee who sat up the whole night waiting to greet the visitors as they came through. As Dave had predicted, most folks checked in early in the morning and checked out at midday, neither of which would be covered by my shift. Most people who were staying over were safely in their rooms by 10 p.m., well before my shift started, and only 1 or 2 ever rattled in drunk during the early hours, and even they just staggered and swayed woozily towards their rooms. I went to the supermarket the next morning, having not slept, and looked like a zombie. The second night, I decided to put Dave's plan into action, set up my chair beneath the CCTV, and slept the entire night through. Just to be on the safe side, I would set periodic alarms on my phone to wake me up every few hours to check on things, and in my first week I bought my own hotelier's bell. The Mariand didn't actually have one of these on its front desk, but having purchased one myself, I would place it on a small coffee table in front of the desk where the brochures usually were. I printed out my own little sign saying, "Ring for assistance," and would set this little display up each night before I went to my rest. That way, if a customer did need my attention, I could be roused quite easily. It was a grand setup, and what's more, it paid well. For the first 2 months, I never had any issues, and despite being alone on that front desk for most of the evening, a situation that due to its loneliness and isolation, especially at night, might make some a little nervous, I never felt scared. Until the scratching started. I call it scratching, but in truth, it was more of a scrape or a shifting. The sound itself made me think of someone removing wallpaper using one of those tiny metal wall scrapers, and the first time I heard it, I wondered whether that was in fact what was going on. One of the guests in a fit of lunacy deciding to take the wallpaper with them as a souvenir. Trust me, stranger things have happened in these hotels. I sat up in my little corner and glanced at my phone for the time. 3:27 a.m. I sat in silence, listening, to see if the sound would come again. Eventually it did, and sure enough, it did have that angular, grating resonance that comes with scraping paper from the walls. It was not, however, the long, gliding strokes one would use in order to achieve that aim. Instead, the sound was a low, rasping movement within the walls, or the space just above the reception area, carving as it did through the silence, like a shark's fin through the surface of the water. The sound stood out far more than it would at any other time, and for the first time I began to feel uneasy. Alone in the silence, with nobody to act as an anchor to reality, The mind begins to wander, and sometimes it takes some very dark paths. I don't mind admitting that as the scratching continued, I did, for a brief moment, conjure up images of long, curled fingernails scraping along the walls, attached not to some form of flesh and blood, but to the room's long, lonesome shadows. I glared up at the muted beige of the ceiling, at the garish chandelier with its green-coloured plastic gemstones, and observed how it was swaying ever so slightly. Then the sound again, now from a space above me, but off to the left. That first night I simply waited for the sound to stop. If there was something going on in the room above and some idiot was wrecking the room, the consequences wouldn't become apparent until I was happily tucking into a breakfast at the local supermarket. It would be someone else's issue to deal with. When the sounds persisted on subsequent days, literally waking me from my dozing at intervals during the week, I began to suspect rats, or that there was something wrong with the plumbing system. I reluctantly ascended the stairs to check which room the sounds were coming from, and to ensure that there wasn't a problem that I was going to have to deal with more immediately. Before I opened the door of room 206, I stopped for a moment and listened. There was definitely something going on in there, which was worrying, considering that this room had not actually been let out that night. If nobody was occupying the room, then why were there sounds coming from inside? I held my ear to the door and listened carefully. The strange, skittering scrapes persisted. I wondered for a moment whether a guest from another room had broken into 206. This was a common occurrence, guests registering in one room but breaking into another in order to do whatever illegal things they wanted to do without being traced to that room. Again, I listened. There was silence in the rest of the hallway, as if the entire floor were waiting, just as I was. Nervously, I placed one hand on the doorknob, and with the other, quietly, I swiped the keycard. Then, being deliberately so loud as to let anyone who might be inside know that I was entering, I announced myself, stepped through the door, and inserted the keycard into the slot to make the lights come on. Doing this meant that, for a moment, I had my back turned to the room. I wished that I hadn't. For as I turned, at the moment just after the light switched on, I detected movement. Saw it reflected in the wardrobe mirror. Something or someone had darted out of sight. It's hard to explain, but to me, it looked almost as if the shadows themselves had retreated, as if the dark, rather than being instantly switched to light with the insertion of the card, had taken a moment to disappear, delayed its departure, and in that second had left behind some vestige of a trail, a marker of where it had once been, for me to catch a glimmer of in the corner of my eye. I froze and looked around the room, not stepping into the space, but observing it through the mirror. It was empty, stuffy, and tinged with the musty tang of old tobacco, as if someone, despite the rules, had been smoking in there. I listened for the sound and realized that it had stopped. Cautiously, I removed the card from the slot and closed up the room, thankful that the shut-off was not immediate and that I had a few seconds of light before I shut the door. Though the noises persisted, I never went up to room 206 again. In fact, I made a point of avoiding the place. Whatever was shuffling about above me was someone else's problem. My only other dealing with the room, which only cemented my determination not to enter again, was a brief conversation with one of the cleaners. She asked me whether I had ever heard noises coming from that room. I mentioned the scratching and saw the woman's face go pale. She said that another woman, a cleaner who had worked at the hotel previously, had told her never to go into that room. That she had once walked in during a night shift and, after turning on the light, had seen something moving under the walls. When I asked what she was supposed to have meant by this, my cleaner shrugged. She said there were lamps, like bubbles, under the wallpaper, but that they were moving around, that there were these weird scratching noises, just for a second, but that when she walked in they stopped. I'm only asking because it's on my rota now, and you know, if there's anything weird, you'd hear it because that room is right over the reception." I nodded, and with a pang of guilt told her that she could skip that room on her rounds, that it was rarely occupied, and that I'd say someone requested a late checkout so the cleaning duty would go to the afternoon shift, during the daylight hours. She appreciated that. When summer ended and I returned to my regular classes, I knew that I couldn't keep up the 3 jobs, so I quit the supermarket with a promise that I would pick up some hours around Christmas time when they always needed more staff. Since I didn't need the free meals anymore, I also handed in my notice at the burger joint, but offered to increase my hours at the hotel. My idea was that on the nights that I didn't just sleep right through, I could work on my essays or do some of the reading I should have been getting on with during the day when I was instead watching Murder, She Wrote and Doctors on daytime TV. One morning, my apprehension towards room 206 became far more immediate. Johnny, a slightly older fellow who worked the day shift and with whom I often shared a few laughs as our clocking on and off times overlapped, came to me at the start of my late shift. He had a strange, worried look on his face, and glanced about him furtively, as if he were about to confide in me something that he didn't want others to hear. "Last night," he began, his voice low and his face leaned in close to mine, "a woman checked in around 3 a.m., a dark-haired lady. Thai, judging by the name." I nodded. I had actually been awake when the woman had walked in, teetering a little on the high heels that seemed a little too high for her in her inebriated state. She had checked in for a pre-booked room, paid by credit card, and gone up to the room, presumably to sleep. No other customers or guests had graced the desk that night, so I remembered her well and told Johnny so. "Well, the thing is, she checked in, but she never checked out. I mean, she went up to the room and everything, went inside, but never came out again." I stared at Johnny blankly. I suggested that perhaps she left the room in the night and for some reason took the fire escape. Johnny shook his head. "I've watched the CCTV, in the halls and at the bottom of the fire escape. Nobody came in or out. When we went up to see her this morning, when she failed to check out, we found the door was locked from the inside, and we had to get one of the skeleton keys and bust the door to sort it. I half expected to find her dead in there. Overdosed or choked on her own vomit or whatever, but no. We went in, and, well, there was nothing. The bed had clearly been slept in. There was some mess where she had showered and stuff, and all her belongings were still there, but no woman. It's like she just vanished into thin air." I was going to ask Johnny what room the woman was staying in, but having given her the key myself, I already knew. "Thing is," he continued, leaning in even further and once again checking that he couldn't be heard, "this isn't the first time it's happened. Lorna, the girl I work with, says that something similar happened 2 years ago with some businessman who checked in. He went up to the room, left all his stuff there, and just vanished in a puff of smoke. She told Mr. Deng about it, but nothing. That was the last she heard of it. What I'm wondering now is, do I tell Mr. Deng about this woman, or do I tell somebody else?" Now it was my turn to look around. Whilst I had only met Mr. Deng in person once before, I did know him by reputation. Ostensibly a successful businessman who owned a number of hotels and a large casino complex, he was also regarded as the sort of man that you did not want angry at you. The idea that Johnny might tell someone, anyone else, about the goings-on at the hotel before he told Deng struck me as the sort of thing that might make him mad and make Johnny regret his actions. Clearly, my eyes communicated this without me having to say a word, because Johnny simply nodded. "I should tell Deng first, right?" I agreed, solemnly. That was the last I heard of the disappearing woman, and the last I spoke of it until now, though I am happy to admit that the entire story did make me highly uneasy. Following Johnny's story about the Thai lady and the businessman, I made a point to avoid booking people into that room. Whenever I was required for some reason to go into that part of the hotel, I would walk very hurriedly past the door, and every now and again, when the reception was quiet and the hotel as still as death, I would glance down at the monitors for the corridor outside the room, just to check what might be there. Despite this sense of unease, in many other ways the first few months were fine. After Johnny's story, I found it much harder to ignore the scratching when it came, but the purchase of an iPod and some decent headphones took care of that problem. Everything was good until 2 rather large bumps in the road appeared to ruin the plan. The first was Deakin. The second was the man he was asking about. Randall Deakin had been a police officer for over 20 years. He had a fairly good understanding of how things worked within his section of the city, who ran what, and how the various illegal businesses and networks interlocked with each other. In the weeks leading up to his first visit with me, he noticed the Marianne had taken on a far more important role in the little dramas he had reason to follow. The first time he had visited, he had needed to ring the bell 4 times before I awoke. No sooner had I staggered, bleary-eyed, to my feet, pulling my earphones painfully from my ears, than Deakin was shoving pictures under my nose and asking me to identify people. It took me a moment to register what was actually going on. "I want to ask you about these 2 men. Now, we know that they have visited these premises, and that in the last 2 weeks they have booked rooms here 3 times under names that are not their own, and, on each occasion, they have entered the hotel only to leave less than 2 hours later and not come back. What I want to know is, what do you know about these men and their reasons for coming to and from the hotel?" I stared at the photographs. Some were blurry, pixelated images from CCTV, the others appeared to be mugshots. Both men were familiar. "Wait, so what you're saying is they check in, spend an hour or 2, and leave again?" I quizzed, looking over the photographs, with the hope of acting as if I was unaware of who the men were, and that I was trying with all my effort to dredge up some memory that might be of use. "Yes, they usually check in around 9 p.m. and are gone again by 11 p.m., almost as if they have arranged the hotel room as a meeting point for discussion." He said this last part with real emphasis, as if we were both of us participating in some crime drama, and I was supposed to see the greater significance of a plot point through what he was saying. I didn't. I screwed up my eyes and once again regarded the photographs. "Okay, a few things," I started. "Firstly, checking into a hotel, then leaving an hour or 2 later is normal. Most people book a hotel to sleep in, and the rest of the time they want to see the city or do something. They usually check in, freshen up, have a shower and whatever, and then head out. That's what most people do. They probably went out on the lash and then came back to the room in the early hours," I said with a shrug, feeling for a moment as if I were explaining the points of some important case back to the lead investigator. "Secondly, if 2 guys did book into a room, stay for a few hours and then leave, then who are we to judge? There are plenty of other things they might have wanted the privacy of a hotel room for that aren't illegal. You know, things that might take a few hours, if you know what I mean. They're both consenting adults. Good luck to them, I say." Deakin did not look amused, and was clearly ready to jump in to express his dissatisfaction at the flippancy of my answers, but I just carried on. "Finally, you said they checked in around 8 and then left around 11 p.m.? I don't start shift until midnight, so I wouldn't have seen them come or go. You can leave your card, and if I do hear or see anything unusual, then I'll give you a call. But considering I wouldn't even be here when they were around, I'm not sure I can be of much use to you, I'm afraid." Deakin eyed me suspiciously, not realizing as he did that my last 2 words were the stone-cold truth. Unbeknownst to Deakin, I had recognized both the men in the photographs, though one of them not from the hotel. Even my flatmates, who unlike me had not lived in this city very long, knew who Gary Keenan was. A notorious gangster involved in drugs, armed robbery, and all manner of other criminal activities. He had been in the newspaper more times than most page 3 girls. With his shaved bald head, thick bollard of a neck, and perennially angry, screwed-up features, Keenan always looked to me like a particularly angry thumb. It was a face that once you saw it, you did not forget in a hurry. It was also one I had never seen in real life and hoped not to. The man in the second photograph was the owner of the hotel, Mr. Deng. The idea that Keenan and the Chinese gentleman, as Deakin described him, though I was fairly sure Deng was Vietnamese, had been frequenting the hotel and gotten the police interested made me nervous, but not as nervous as the prospect that someone might see me talking to a policeman who was flashing photographs of Keenan and Deng whilst I was seen to cooperate. That was the kind of scenario which, if noted, could end very badly for the person doing the talking. I was afraid, and over the next few shifts I did not sleep much at all. Around a week later, Deakin returned. He asked if he and I could have a chat, informally. Knowing that the alternative would probably involve me heading to the police station, I decided to sit at a nearby coffee table and listen to what Deakin had to say. At first, he was rather coy, asking general questions about the hotel and about how long I had worked there. He then asked how business had been and mentioned, almost offhandedly, how there had been an awful lot more bookings in the last week. I did not answer, but I had nodded. It would have been stupid not to, as he could quite easily just have requested to see the booking forms or the computer records. Plus, he knew before he asked that he was right. Over the past few nights, I had hardly slept. I had even missed lectures during the day because I had been too tired to attend them, having been forced, annoyingly, to actually work during my shift. In all the time that I had worked at the hotel, I had never seen it so busy. A steady parade of customers checking into the hotel throughout the night at ridiculous hours of the morning. Deakin explained these facts to me as if I had not been the one to personally experience them. All night, a steady stream of folks checking in. Funny, isn't it? All of a sudden? I shrugged, before adding that it wasn't my job to analyze the customers or evaluate the level of humor. I just had to check them in. You know what else is funny? He asked, staring directly into my eyes as I bit my lip and resisted the urge to answer, your haircut? All of the people who checked in at these funny hours, they were all men, every one of them. They all stayed until morning, they left after your shift was over. In every case, they had a double room, and the room's other occupant, a woman, was already in the room. She had checked in before your shift started, but she didn't freshen up and go out like you said the other day. She stayed in the room all night, waiting for her gentleman caller. I shrugged. I saw what he was driving at and what he was suggesting. I honestly hadn't noticed the gender of the callers and obviously had no way of knowing who had come and gone before or after my shift, but Deakin was dead set on ensuring that I put two and two together. I am going to suggest that the meetings between those two men I was asking you about were to make sure that this little arrangement could go ahead, he said flatly, once again producing photos of the two men and forcing me to glance around me nervously to ensure we were not being watched. I made a note to erase the CCTV tapes later so as to get rid of any footage that might show me talking to the police whilst photos of Deng and Keenan were flashed around. This fella here, he said, tapping his finger on a particularly thumb-like face. He's a local, shall we say, businessman? The other fella is a Mr. Deng. He should be familiar to you. He owns the Mariand. Now, I am going to suggest that since the hotel has not been getting an awful lot of business lately, these two men came to an agreement which would allow Mr. Deng to ensure that the rooms were occupied every night of the week, whilst Mr. Keenan also managed to make some money out of the whole affair. You follow me, son? I nodded. What Deakin was suggesting was that Keenan was using the rooms to house women who would then be visited by men willing to pay for their services. Mr. Deng would get paid by having a full hotel, Mr. Keenan would get the security of being able to house his business somewhere with an air of legitimacy, and would get paid by taking a cut of the girl's money. It was a win-win for the men involved. Far less so for the poor, exploited women. Now, the reason we want to speak to you about all this is because of the visitor to room 206. Again, I shrugged, though inside I felt my stomach tighten. I can check the log and the CCTV, but I can't remember off the top of my head who checked into that room. I muttered reluctantly. Deakin leaned forward and furrowed his brow. "We already know who checked in, Sonny." As he said this, he tapped on the photograph of Gary Keenan. "Mr. Keenan went up there around 11:30 p.m., just before your shift started, conveniently. The problem we have is that according to our surveillance tapes, he hasn't come out yet. Over 24 hours later, and that man hasn't so much as made a peep, and nobody has gone in or out of that room." Again, I shrugged. I was a desk clerk, not a hall monitor or a missing persons bureau. He could have come or gone at any time whilst I wasn't there. I acted quite nonchalant, and as if this revelation about this hardened criminal's vanishing act hadn't rattled me. In truth, it had affected me for a number of reasons. To start with, the fact that Deakin knew he hadn't left the building, either by the front entrance or by the fire escapes, meant that he was watching the place, or at least had someone watching the place all of the time. Though I wasn't doing anything wrong, the idea of being surveilled at all times made me uncomfortable, though not as uncomfortable as the thought of someone entering that room and not coming out again. As I mulled over these ideas, Deakin produced from his pocket a document which he unfolded and placed on the table before me. "These are the blueprints for the hotel. You notice anything unusual about the way everything is set up?" I glanced at the blueprint, an overview of the floor plans, and could just about make out the layout of the hotel. I didn't notice anything of great significance. Deakin, as I was hoping he wouldn't, tapped on the location of room 206. "The specifications. Look at the thickness of the walls around this room." I stared at the plans, again not really seeing what Deakin was getting at. "These walls are 4 times thicker than the rest of the rooms. The floor of the room is directly over reception, so that no one in the room below would be able to listen in on what's being said, and the walls on either side are super thick. If you were to X-ray this entire building, what you'd find is a hotel built around a concrete cube. It's the sort of thing that embassies and government agencies that value their privacy do. They create a room within their departments where they can't be bugged or attacked. Now, ask yourself, why would anyone want a room like that building into their hotel?" I didn't answer, which was fortunate because Deakin was planning to go on. "Every time your boss has met with Keenan, we know it has taken place in that room. Now we have records of Deakin going in but not coming out. What I want to know is, what's going on? And you, Sonny Jim, are going to help me find out. You have access to the CCTV footage for inside and outside the rooms. We need those from you. We also need access to the room itself, so that we can find out what really went on in there." With this last sentence, Deakin gave a small, knowing smile, a smile that told me I was a pawn in a much bigger game, and that there was a lot going on that I didn't know about. It was also a smile that told me that Deakin knew more than he was letting on. Right then and there, I made a decision. "I can give you the CCTV footage," I said, rising from my seat and moving back towards the desk. Deakin nodded, and rising from his seat, made as if to follow me to the back of the desk. I turned and stood in his way, blocking him from coming into the staff-only area. "When you come back with the correct paperwork. I think it'll be a warrant or a court order or something. I'll let my managers and my boss know that you want them, and I'll have them ready for you when you arrive." Deakin's face fell. He had fully expected me to simply hand over the footage that could potentially incriminate people who would then be looking to find out who handed it over. Not likely. He protested a few times, made some idle threats about me getting in the way of an investigation and possibly facing charges myself, all of which I knew was nonsense. Eventually, he told me that he would be back the next day for the tapes, and that I was going to hand them over whether I liked it or not. I nodded and smiled. I waited for Deakin to leave the lobby. I watched the clock and gave it a full 10 minutes for him to go, and then I sprinted towards the lift. I went up to the second floor and, with my heart pounding in my chest, approached room 206. Cautiously, I applied the skeleton key card that would allow me to unlock any of the guest rooms, and once the lock had opened, I knocked loudly a few times, and then carefully began to push the door open. All the time I was doing this, feeling the blood pumping in my temples, I was listening. Not for the movements of Keenan or for someone sleeping inside, but for the scratching, for the sounds that I had heard on so many nights and had tried to block out. Somehow, I knew that Keenan wouldn't be found there, that in all likelihood he would never be found again. But luckily, it wasn't him that I was looking for. In my estimation, Deakin had been far too confident, far too cocky about finding out what was going on in that room. Even for someone watching from outside, he seemed to think he had the inside scoop. As he had flashed me that wry, knowing smile, I had remembered a man, around 3 weeks ago, being very specific about wanting to book room 206. I had also remembered that I had been fearful about him being in that room, and so had waited, without my earphones, listening for the sounds. Rather than the scratching, I heard instead banging, and at one point what sounded like the whir of a drill or electric screwdriver. The same man had not stayed the night, but, looking back at the desk and assuming me to be asleep, had left the hotel without checking out at around 4 a.m. I remembered that man, and when Deakin smiled, I realized what he'd been up to. It took me less than 5 minutes to find the camera, tucked behind some badly plastered cornice in the corner of the room. After that, it was just a matter of tracing the wires before I found a small recording device, clearly storing digital files of the footage that was being recorded. The device had been stored behind the bathroom cabinet, which had been unscrewed and then fitted back onto the wall, the missing patches of garish yellow paint showing where it had been lifted from its position and replaced. Taking the device and the camera, detached from its position and its wires unfurled, I returned to the front desk. With only a few clicks and the downloading of some basic software, I was able to load the video files from the recording device onto the computer, to see what the police wanted to see, and to witness precisely what happened to Gary Keenan. It was not something I enjoyed watching. I saw Keenan enter the room. I watched him make phone calls and move into the bathroom. He came out 20 minutes later, wrapped in a towel, having presumably showered, and I saw him make the second round of phone calls. After a while, he began to pace the room, clearly agitated and presumably waiting for someone. I watched him perform this back-and-forth walk until, all at once, he lunged at the door and seemed to try the lock from the inside. I paused the footage. Bringing up the time, I checked the hotel's own CCTV footage from the corridor outside. What I saw was a heavily built man emerge from room 205 holding a chair. This chair was then placed in the corridor up against the door of 206, barring whoever was inside from escaping. Which, of course, he had reason to. The footage was silent. The sound presumably recorded on some other device I hadn't been able to locate. Still, watching the images, I was able, in my own head at least, to hear the sounds that weren't there. I watched Gary Keenan turn and stare at the walls, saw him backing up against the desk, almost falling over, and heard in my head that same deep, resonant scratching. The scrape along with the plaster and the brick as something or some things moved within the walls. I watched the pale body of Gary Keenan dart, panicked, around the room, and stared in horror as a thin, spindle leg, like that of some enormous spider, and yet the length of a man's forearm, emerged in a strange arcing motion from the darkness in the corner of the room. I imagined I could hear the soft, skittering movements as more and more legs emerged from gaps in the wallpaper, could hear Keenan's screams as 1, 2, then 10 of these creatures, each the size of a small cat, bluish in colour and with the plumply swollen body of a tick, scurry slowly towards him. At first he fought as they clambered onto him, each one in turn leaping and fastening its legs around his arms and chest with the sort of wrapping grip one's hand might take on an orange or a cricket ball, the legs encircling the limb, and the bulbous thickness of the thing pressed itself against the flesh. It was no use fighting. Blood began to pour from the areas where each of these things had fastened. The chest, both legs, the arms. One scurried over another and raised itself to the top of Keenan's head, his eyes rolling upwards and his mouth opening into a silent scream as another inserted itself into his gaping mouth and began in earnest to suck. I watched, transfixed for 15 minutes, as dozens of these things, the largest the size of a small cat, but most the size of toads, emerged from the walls and fastened themselves onto the body of Gary Keenan. A body that by the time these things, full and swollen with blood and tissue, crept back to their hiding places, had been entirely consumed. I stopped the clip, removed the disc, stuffed it into my pocket. Then I removed the old-fashioned VHS tape on which the hotel's CCTV was recorded. When I left my shift that morning, I took both with me. For a terrifying moment, when I first spoke to Mr. Deng about the footage, he thought I was attempting to blackmail him, that I, in possession of the evidence of his plot to do away with Keenan, was going to try to extort money from him. In fact, I did the opposite. Placing both tapes down on the table between us, I gave them to him willingly, ensuring him, though not entirely truthfully, that these were the only copies. All I said, in clarifying what I had seen, was that I believed that room 206 should perhaps not be rented out as often, and that I could be trusted. "That room has bed bugs," I mentioned flatly. Whilst he agreed about the bugs, Mr. Deng disagreed about closing up the room. He assured me that the concrete around the room made it secure, and that in the 12 years since he had discovered the dust mites, bed bugs, and ticks, they had never spread to any other part of the hotel, preferring to remain in their territory as long as they received a steady stream of nourishment. He explained that room 206 was, to him, an excellent place to house bad people, people who did bad things, or people whom he considered bad for his business. He also mentioned that it would be far easier for him to make his guests comfortable in that room if he had a desk clerk who knew just how to ensure that they got a good night's sleep, and would be discreet when it came to recording their eventual checkout times. I nodded that I understood, and Mr. Deng smiled in appreciation. Over the next 6 years, I steadily climbed the ranks to become a hotel manager. As it turned out, I was easily able to afford the rest of my university fees, but decided to remain working at the hotel once I had finished. On paper, I am paid the usual hotel manager's salary. Though, of course, off paper, my arrangements with Mr. Deng mean that I have other sources of income. In the 6 years since the death of Gary Keenan, I have personally helped 16 bad people to get comfortable in room 206, including the very curious Mr. Deakin, who, after accusing me of tampering with evidence, insisted upon having time alone in the room to check things out. I'm not entirely sure what his investigations uncovered, but I can certainly imagine. Deakin's disappearance did make headlines, though none of them linked directly back to the hotel, and Mr. Deng managed to use his connections to avoid any terribly bad press for the place, despite the rumors of a string of disappearances linked to room 206. As for the room itself, it remains the only room in the hotel that has a lock on the outside of the door as well as the inside, and the only one that has ever had a problem with bed bugs, though of course none of the clients unfortunate enough to stay in that particular room has ever made a complaint. This has been Room 206, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell, copyright 2021 by Michael Vandervoort, production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.